welcome once again to a Hobby Memorial Library virtual event. We have a very special guest today. We have Dr. Mervyn Roberts. He is a CTC History Professor, and he has a major interest in the Vietnam War. Lots of published work, and we are just thrilled to have him talk about the Vietnam War and the use of GIS analysis. So welcome, Dr. Roberts, and you just take it away.
All right, well, thanks, Cynthia. Let me throw the slides up here, and thanks to the library for inviting me to talk today. One of the difficulties in understanding anti-insurgency is the fact that no clear front lines exist. A conventional war in which arrows move boldly forward and backwards in large operations is easier for most people to understand. By 1967, the Military Assistance Command Vietnam had gathered enormous amounts of data in an effort to understand the war. Unfortunately, computers were in their infancy when this data was collected, and as seen here, using just one of those data sets, incapable of presenting the data in useful ways. The inability to visualize progress in the Vietnam War ultimately helped sap public opinion. Geographic information system software promises to open up the data in a way the collectors never could dream of. Terrain, elevation, population, events, boundaries, and many other data types can be laid on top of each other, allowing an analyst to access nearly infinite combinations. On paper maps, these layers can't be peeled back. GIS allows that. Hotspot analysis helps to discern areas of high enemy activity, much like police departments do to allocate their resources. Analysts can also use temporal animations to see the flow over time. Since many of the sets have dates and times associated with them, you can literally animate the data. These new tools for historians to analyze and visualize will help to explain a complex war to their readers. As will be seen in the maps today, by layering data collected during the Vietnam War, the lines and contested areas emerge. Combining multiple data sets will transform our understanding of the war and bring up new questions to investigate. These packages have existed for decades and are widely used in city planning, crime fighting, and real estate development. However, only in the last decade or so have the first tentative steps been begun towards using them in historical scholarship. Several examples of using GIS for historical research exist. The Slave Trade Database tracks the shipment of slaves in the Atlantic over a 300-year period. The movement of ships and their cargo can be tracked from embarkation to destination, and as you see on the screen here, you can track by the country of origin of the ship, as well as the size of the bubble, showing you the size of the cargo, the number of people or slaves being transported, and exactly where they're going to. The Mapping Occupation site provides a tool to track federal occupation of the South following the Civil War. As seen in this sequence, by 1871, the federal forces had almost no control in the South as they resumed their frontier duties. Another good example is Australia's Vietnam War. This is a site created by the Australian War Memorial that tracks over 6,000 combat incidents on an interactive map. The site links enemy contact reports and casualty information with veterans' recollections and photos to produce a unique archive for Australia's involvement in the war. For operational analysis of the Vietnam War, a wealth of data nearly untouched by historians awaits exploitation. Much of this data contains geographic points, which is ideal for GIS. It should be noted, many other data sets beyond the ones I will just discuss today exist. I would argue that no war in history has as much GIS data available. Certainly, I did 2 tours in Afghanistan. We did use GIS, tracking of forces and vehicles. So we have pretty good data on where people went. We have pretty good data on troops in contact, those sorts of things through what was called the Sydney system. But the stuff we have for Vietnam, in many respects, goes a lot deeper than the stuff that was collected and was kind of spotty in many areas in Afghanistan, at least in my experience. I would argue no war in history has as much GIS data available as the Vietnam War. All the data is imperfect. In other words, it was collected during wartime. Grid locations could be entered incorrectly at times. However, expecting perfection in wartime is not realistic for any type of document. If treated by the historian as any document should, carefully weighed and scrutinized, these data sets provide new avenues to analyze this complex war. Utilizing the sets discussed, for instance, the operations of both sides in the months prior to the Tet Offensive can be analyzed. The various theories about what happened can be tested. While not likely to produce a definitive answer by itself, this will aid in both visualizing the events and determining potential theory faults for further investigation. To begin my study, base maps for the Vietnam War depicting the region as it existed were derived from current digitized maps for Southeast Asia. Borders for 1968 were traced from US military maps, then geo-rectified over satellite maps of the region. River, road, province, and district layers were all likewise created. Each point or area represents an array of data that can be analyzed. Here you see the district level map visualized to show population density, and you can see the array off to the right-hand side of your screen, I think. And so you can see where is the population, primarily along the coast. And so it helps you see that clearly. Let's see. So the first MACV data set to be discussed is the enemy base area file. This produced a polygon of support base areas for the years 1966 to 1971. Provides information on the base area monthly status throughout the year, and codes describe the actions that Allied forces were taking against that base area, such as clear and hold, search and destroy, or penetrated. And again, you see the array off to the side with the description of each of those polygons, and in that case, it's base area 117 in Core 1. The Southeast Asia Friendly Forces file tracked each friendly maneuver battalion headquarters location at the beginning of the month from October of 1966 to 1972 in July. Each of the nearly 20,000 points contains data on the unit's name and type, country, current headquarters location, and various tracking numbers. The system gives an approximation of combat force deployment because it does not track companies, which often operated some distance from the battalion. In this case, the array shows the 26 Marines at Khe Sanh. Here's a close-up of the Da Nang area, again, with the Southeast Asia Friendly Forces file overlaid. And I want you to pay attention to base area 116 there. We're going to come back to that later today. But you can see in this case, Marine forces largely based outside of the Da Nang area, north of the Qua Dai River, and base area 116 is a highly mountainous region, a good place for the enemy to hide out and use as a support base. The Viet Cong initiated incidents file contains data from January of 1963 to December of 1971, derived from unit spot reports, or in other words, reports of contact with the enemy. The file plots locations of attacks on Allied military forces. Data for each point includes the number of enemy killed, captured, incident location, date, time, and a situation report ID that links to the actual spot report for further analysis. It's not directly linked, but if you had a spot report, you would be able to track it to the specific incident if you were, as a historian, digging into an archives. Although mistakes in location, time, and input errors are possible, personal bias is unlikely in this system since any reported enemy contact was processed into the VCIIF. A related file contains friendly casualties, but not location data. So if there's any computer geeks out there who'd like to work with me, I'm sure we can figure out a way to link those two files, and then you'd be able to populate that as well. The terrorist incident reporting system collected data on all enemy-initiated activities against civilians, identified by the South Vietnamese National Police and the Combined Intelligence Center of Vietnam between October of 1967 and February of 1973. The TERS included actions such as harassment of local officials, propaganda, terrorism, and assassinations. The file did not include conventional firefights, which were collected by the BCIF. So between that and the TERS, a general estimate of enemy operations and intent can be outlined. Each point in this series, the TERS, contains data on the date and time of the incident, location, means of attack and results, the enemy's objective, size of the attacking force, and casualties. This allows you to visualize and filter the data to analyze specific methods of attack. Here, I've used police crime analysis symbols. You could filter also by type of attack, and so assassinations or propaganda, whatever you're looking at, you can filter that out. Unfortunately here, it's a little grainy in this particular image, but if you look at the legend, I think you can see the types of symbols that are being used here. The Hamlet evaluation system is the most frequently cited computer data file from the Vietnam War and the most maligned. MACV relied for the HES data on subjective reporting by U.S. subsector advisors on each Hamlet in their area of responsibility. So beginning in January of 1967, these advisors sent monthly HES reports to MACV for data processing. Data for each point included the Hamlet name, location, population. Unfortunately, that population data is corrupted in the modern version of this thing. Everything had to be converted from what was called EBIDIC. It's an old 1960s file format. And in the process of conversion, those population numbers are not very reliable. It also contained 18 status indicators measuring security and socioeconomic development. Various combinations of these scores produce security and development scores to help allocate development and security aid. However, HES was not created to predict enemy activities. Criticisms of the program centered often on the inability to predict the Tet Offensive. However, the system was not designed for that purpose. Now, if you look on the screen there, you see an example of one of those classifications for security score and what it required to meet each of those categories. And so Viet Cong ineffective, no incidents that month would be an A-level Hamlet, and of course, D, Viet Cong reduced in control at night, some government influence. So you see the spectrum there. Based on these ratings, the Viet Cong control level is misleading though. If those VC controlled Hamlets, which I have here in red, were judged by the same criteria as A-level Hamlets for government control, the number of truly Viet Cong controlled Hamlets would be very low. For instance, based on the criteria to be listed as a B, no enemy within 6 hours, because the Allied forces had helicopters, armored vehicles, and jet bombers, they could strike anywhere in much less time than that. Thus, while the HES overstated the level of National Liberation Front control, accepting that designation allows for some self-correction against potential bias from the data created by overzealous subsector advisors, which is a common claim about the HES. A solid assumption is that if the data says the village was Viet Cong controlled, it was. Likewise, if the Hamlet is listed as A status, it probably met that criterion. Every place else is contested, and so those B to D scores really need to be visualized in that way. By using the data carefully, trends emerge that enable visualization of the war on a new level. Hence, although the system might not have been perfect for its original purpose, it can still provide a deeper understanding of the war for the historian. Balanced with captured documents, operational reports, and other data described here today, the HES can help understanding the control status at the tactical level. By December of 1967, the monthly Hamlet evaluation survey had been ongoing for nearly a year. The annual report, the first annual report, showed Viet Cong Hamlet control had decreased from 24% to 20%. Hamlets fully controlled by the government had grown from 3% to 5%. Both sides were fighting for control of the remaining 71% that neither fully controlled. While not spectacular, the shift and trend seemed to be moving in the right direction to leaders in Saigon. More importantly, Viet Cong controlled population had dropped from 3.2 million to 2.8 million by December of 1967. The front controlled many hamlets, but little population. Comparing the HES to Viet Cong perception of population control from captured documents, you can see the general accuracy of the HES system. In July of 1967, North Vietnam's Politburo decided to launch a widespread offensive against South Vietnam in response to this loss of control. The North spent 6 months preparing the offensive, moving supplies, drafting forces, and promising ultimate victory early in the new year. The Central Committee finalized plans for the general offensive general uprising in early January of 1968. The goals of the offensive were to create conditions for a coalition government and the withdrawal of American forces. Propaganda and internal Viet Cong North Vietnamese documents throughout the fall pledged this outcome and that the outcome of the offensive was going to be decisive. In line with this, propaganda organs demanded stepped-up assassinations to prepare the ground for the offensive. That aspect of the plan is shown here on this map. The rising tide of assassinations in the fall of 1967 is directly in line with the Politburo plan and North Vietnamese propaganda that began in September. The key objectives of that offensive were to seize Saigon, Hue, and Da Nang, and Northern leaders also sought to simultaneously inflict a devastating defeat on U.S. forces by overrunning a remote base. Assassinations were a critical part of that plan to weaken government control prior to the offensive. In line with North Vietnamese directives, the Viet Cong stepped up assassinations and other terror acts from October to December. As seen here, the black stars are assassinations layered over a hotspot analysis that clearly shows this terror campaign was centered on the coastal areas and the region around Saigon. Again, it's about preparing the ground for this coming offensive, destabilizing the local government, make it easier to overthrow. The next slide shows a number of Viet Cong incidents for the entire pre-Tet period. First, the individual incidents are plotted. Then the incidents are scaled by the number of Viet Cong killed under a hotspot intensity overlay. Da Nang is clearly the focus of the fighting that fall. The Tet Plan is often depicted by historians as a multi-phased operation. Attack remote border areas to lure American forces away from South Vietnam cities, followed by the Tet Offensive to ignite a general uprising, leading to the fall of South Vietnamese government and exit of Allied forces. According to this argument, Hanoi carried out attacks near the South Vietnamese border to lead the Allies to believe a more conventional operation was in the offing and draw U.S. and ARVN forces away from the cities. However, the data reveal an apparent lack of any attempt to draw Allied forces out of the cities prior to Tet. As these maps indicate, the violence that fall remained in the populated coastal areas, fixing Allied forces in place. Were there a concerted plan to entice Americans to the West, one would expect fewer attacks on U.S. units in the coastal areas. This shows First Corps area in fall of 1967. and highlights Khe Sanh. This series includes a hotspot analysis from December and January prior to Tet as well. On the eve of Tet, the U.S. had deployed more troops to Khe Sanh, but had massed much more around Hue and Da Nang. To be sure, attacks on the outposts such as Khe Sanh and Loc Ninh did occur. However, in both maps, the coastal plain was the focus of northern attention prior to Tet. And this is really in line with the plan as they had drawn it up. The map shows the intensity of violence across First Corps area from 1 November to the beginning of the Khe Sanh battle. Beyond a few high-profile movements to Khe Sanh, which captured the attention of the Americans at home, the only significant redeployment was towards Saigon shortly before the Tet holiday. It appears likely the attack on Khe Sanh was pushed forward by 10 days to 21 January, after the North Vietnamese realized General Westmoreland's deployment of forces to the remote outbase threatened their plan to overrun a lightly held camp. It's doubtful the North would have done this if the plan was to draw the enemy out. The change forced them to strike or fail. In other words, intelligence pointed the Americans to Khe Sanh precisely because it was a target for the general offensive, not a deception to draw forces away. When the offensive began at the end of the month, the urban uprising fizzled except for Hue, and their forces massed at Khe Sanh suffered immense losses. Those forces could have been much better used to bolster the attack on Da Nang and Hue. Focusing on Quang Nam, the province with the most VC incidents that fall, the violence occurred almost exclusively within a 10 square mile area less than 10 miles from Da Nang. Overlaying the HES data on the operations and using spatial analysis tools, such as hotspot analysis here, clearly identifies the battle lines when combined with the VCIIF and TERS data. Here I've combined those with the Southeast Asia Friendly Forces and population and a hot-cold analysis of the Hamlet control. From this map of hotspot analysis in early 1967, it's clear the Marines only controlled a couple square miles around Da Nang. The VC was in complete control south of the Qua Dai River, also known as the Tu Bon River. The Marines arrived in 1965 and first sought to secure the Da Nang airport, then pushed out to pacify the rocket launch zone in 1966. As the Americans and Army of the Republic of Vietnam operations began to take a toll on the National Liberation Front in 1966, enemy units prepared for a long struggle. Increasingly, they fell back on guerrilla and political warfare. The Marine campaign priorities for 1967 were clearing the area between Da Nang and An Hoa and securing the Khe Sanh Valley to extend government control. U.S. Marines in First Corps conducted 43 large unit operations in the first 6 months of 1967, including thousands of patrols and ambushes in the Da Nang area alone. The main enemy force confronting the Marines was the 2nd PAVN Division in the area around Base Area 116 that I mentioned earlier. By the end of the year, the Qua Dai River was the front line. This indicates the enemy was had primarily attacked in the contested areas that they were trying to retain in the face of these Marine assaults in 1967. On the other hand, most Allied operations were conducted into the enemy-controlled areas to further disrupt and interdict troops, gain control of population and rice production, which were critical resources for the insurgents. The area around Khe Sanh, south of Base Area 116, was the focus. By December, the targets for 1967, while not cleared, had been pierced. These facts support the idea that the Viet Cong and PAVN were on the defensive that year, despite propaganda claims to the contrary. This mapping brings into sharp relief the battle lines obscured by the nature of the war. Looking at the HES, TERS, and VCII overlays from earlier in the year shows a clear progression pushing the Viet Cong back towards Base Area 116, south of the Qua Dai River. Mapping VC incidents helps in determining who controlled an area. However, keep in mind that incident quantity drops if either the government or the front took control of an area. Areas strongly held by either side had few incidents. The areas with the most violence is the contested front line. Looking at the Quang Nam security situation seems to bear this out. Most of the assassinations that fall took place within 2 miles of the Qua Dai River. The war remained a war for control of the population, and more work with post-Tet data may help to understand this process better. And that's what I'm beginning to work on now. Giving this talk today is about beginning to formulate the questions to ask in that process, looking at the data, and then moving forward from the Tet period to look at this post-Tet, where there's a lot of contention over who was winning the war and all that status there. So, although not definitive, the data presented today calls into question the idea that the North Vietnamese Tet plan was to draw forces away from the cities to open the path for the offensive. It also lends support to Ang Cheng Guan's theory that the Battle of Khe Sanh began early as the North reacted to Westmoreland's troop deployments. This analysis also gives credence to Westmoreland's pronouncements of limited progress reported to the American people that fall. He had gone back in November, reported to the American people. Essentially, it's often misquoted that he's saying the end of the war is in sight. He's really saying we're at the beginning of the cave where we can see some light at the other end of the tunnel. So it's usually overstated what he's describing. What he actually says is in line, I would say, with what these maps bear out here. At a minimum, judicious use of these data sets will provide new avenues for investigation and, as indicated today, provide an opportunity to test competing theories about the war. As I mentioned, besides the data discussed today, many other sets, plotting naval gunfire, bombing, Agent Orange use, and so on, are yet untapped. Another complementary resource only recently becoming available is the entire Captured Document Exploitation Center file, which Texas Tech Vietnam Archives is geolocating. They've had those documents available for some time. This is, during the course of the war, U.S. and Allied forces had captured literally millions of pages of enemy documents. And it is just astounding the level of detail of their side of the war that is available from these documents. They also came with location data on where those documents were captured, so they can be plotted against this other GIS data that I've talked about, and use that again to bounce off against the data sets and try to assess the reliability of either of those sets of data. So thanks again to the CTC Library and those watching, taking the time to do that, really appreciate it. Much of this information is based on work from my book and dissertation, Psychological War for Vietnam. And you can go to the website there, mervynroberts.com. I have more information on the book available there. My most recent book is Propaganda and Influence, Russian Chinese Targeting of America. And I have a website of propaganda videos related to that. Just go to my website /Russia. It has to be a capital R, though. It's case sensitive, or you won't get to that website. So I invite you to take advantage of those things, and open to any questions anybody has.
Alyssa, are there any questions before I ask mine? I have so many questions. No questions right now. Okay. Well, this is fascinating. So this was basically a database that people can put, like, wherever they're at, they could put their information in and then have a picture that was available to everyone rather than a small bunch of people pushing little ships and soldiers around in a war room, correct?
No, that's what we would have liked, and that's what we can do today. that's absolutely what they couldn't do at that time.
Okay.
So if I'm a subsector advisor filling out my HES form, it's a paper form. I'd fill it out, it'd already be pre-printed with certain things, and I would check certain blocks. That would get sent back to Saigon. They had a data processing center. So just picture a bunch of people at terminals typing in punch cards. It's literally old-fashioned punch cards for each form, and then that being put into a computer. And then you think, how many data terminals are there to view this? Very few people could access this. And so, the data is amazing. It's imperfect, right? I'm not trying to say there are a lot of problems, but it's an amazing level of data, but it was unusable, literally, as I said in the opening, in the case of the war. Very few people
Right.
had access to the terminal to view it, and there was no way to layer multiple sets like I have here. You would see one set one time, and so very limited usefulness during that time.
So it still hadn't become modern warfare.
Yeah, yeah.
It was getting there, but without
They
the
were thinking
computers.
beyond the capabilities that they had, and
Yeah.
just it going back to my experience in Afghanistan, we had various systems throughout the course of the war. The big one being called Sydney, long acronym. I can't recall what it means at this time, but it would track. Vehicles would all have GPS locators on them, so you could track down to the vehicle, sometimes down to the person. So you could track movements in a way that this map is unable to with the Southeast Asia Friendly Forces file. But we had nothing like any of the human terrain, is what we call it. It's only later in the war we developed human terrain people to try and go out there and figure out who the heck was on the ground. So there was no understanding of that side of the war. And I was involved in that side of the war, and I can tell you there wasn't that stuff. Um, so in many ways, the technology had improved, but our ability to collect data had decreased to a great degree. If we had the stuff that they had then with the capabilities today, it would have given amazing detail of the war. But even with
Well,
that, I would argue the Vietnam War has the most GIS, location data of any war. No, you go back, you study World War II, it's like, well, these guys were kind of in this city, right? And then they moved to that. It's very granular to look at where events are happening, and there's no good tracking system for that stuff. And whereas this is just as I said, pretty amazing sets of data.
well, now that you guys can, have the data for the Vietnam War, um, is this something that can be used in the psychology of warfare now? Do you find that this information has helped in what's happening today? What's still happening with the Vietnam problems? Can you use it in Korea? What's going on in North Korea? Is this information that now is helpful in understanding how people will interact in warfare?
Well, these data sets are being used by different people. Political science people have looked at some of the data sets for various reasons. Some people are trying to map the Agent Orange flights in order to track, the problems related to Agent Orange. And so there are some things like that. There are lessons to be learned about this data, right? In terms of, hey, if you want to understand an insurgency, you need a lot more data than we were necessarily collecting in Afghanistan and Iraq there. This is a model of the types of things. Maybe you refine it and do it better. So maybe there are lessons to be learned in that respect. But the primary purpose, I would say, is trying to understand what the heck happened in this war. And I've often made the point that there are no good histories of the Vietnam War. I wrote a book on the Vietnam War, on the screen. It's one attempt to try to understand this giant elephant, and people have been just grabbing onto the trunk and the tail or whatever based upon usually their political beliefs or their situation, right? If you were a military guy who fought in Vietnam, you're going to come with a certain perspective. And I'm not saying it's wrong, but it's a view of the elephant's trunk, right? And then you got somebody else, you know, an academic maybe looking at the elephant's tail, and they're trying to describe this thing. And because they're often emotionally tied to the war, they're unwilling to give up their position, right? So they're more positional histories. And I think one benefit of this, these systems and these databases for the historian is it gives you a way to kind of try to step back from that, test theories as I kind of described here, to say, well, wait, maybe that's not what happened. Or maybe I need to refine my explanation of what happened in Khe Sanh, what was going on there. And so I think it can help allow historians to ask new questions, get away from maybe these biases, and evaluate the war, and maybe really write the first histories of the war. And you know, I'm a big proponent of trying to use this. I like to talk about it just to try and get people interested in it, because I think if we can get enough historians looking at this data, and again, you know, one often complains, oh, well, it's imperfect data. Every document we got is imperfect, right? You have to accept that going in and then weigh it. I got these two documents that say this, and the GIS says that. How do I evaluate that? That's what a historian should do, and make the decision. Well, you know what? Maybe that subsector, maybe the history is that subsector advisor was a lying jerk. Maybe that's the story, right? He was lying and telling stories about how wonderful things were doing. And so, you know, questions will emerge that you never thought of before. And it really is when you layer the data on top. So if I have a whole lot of Viet Cong incidents in an area where this advisor says it's a green area, he's lying, right? And so that's the story. On the other hand, if there's not many incidents and he's saying it's green, it probably was green, right? As I said, the rest of the areas are contested. That's where the major fighting is taking place. And so when you try to think about fronts, right? As I showed on that first map of World War II, we like nice arrows, and here's the front line, and it moves 2 miles and so on. You don't get that in an insurgency. Same thing in Afghanistan. We didn't have that. You try to shift people to your side of the fence and get their loyalty shifted over, and you move in a, sometimes called an ink spot, but you try to flow out and shift people so there's more loyalty to you than there is to the enemy.
Well, okay, I'm gonna, you know, pretty much disclose my age and the fact that this was during my time, the Vietnam War. And you have such a great point there, because being back in the community, we were told, oh, there's no reason why we need to be in Vietnam War. There were protests. There was, what people were getting back was not a reality of what was going on. And it was extremely washed over. That I recall everyone, you know, because I had cousins that went off to Vietnam War, and you know, nobody quite understood, and there was the protests of why we were there. And so you strike such a good point with this, because now you've got actual proof to show what was going on, to, you know, kind of give some closure to some people. Because I still today hear the Vietnam Wall, we shouldn't have been there. And there was no truth that was coming out of that particular war. So, you know, this is, I can see where where you're always showing people stuff, you know. This seems very important, though, especially to veterans of the Vietnam War, you know, to kind of see a bigger picture.
Well, that brings up a couple of good points. And as I said at the opening, right, if the American people don't understand why they're fighting a war and you're there for 10 years, you're going to lose support for it, right? And I'm not trying to pick a side and say who's right or who's wrong. The question of whether we should have been in Vietnam is a completely different question, right? But if you're going to be in that war, the American people have a short attention span. And if you're going to be there for 10 years, you darn well better be able to explain to them what is happening and that you're winning or that there's a program to win. And we've seen it with Afghanistan, right? And, paid that price there. If you people lose interest and if you can't explain it, and that was really a major problem with the Vietnam War, you couldn't explain it easily. The GIS data, I think, helps historians to present that in an image to say what's going on. And that goes to the second point you made is when you're in combat, your world is very tight. You know what is happening around you. Again, hate to keep harking back. I've done 4 combat tours, and in those combat tours, for the most part, most soldiers, their war is one little valley in a giant country of Afghanistan, and that's it. And if you're in Vietnam and you're some private in the Marines, all you know is you're going into this valley. You don't understand anything about that big picture. And I'm not faulting it. It's just the reality of war. And so maybe that's another thing is some guy can look at it and say, that's right, I was on that operation and now I understand why we were doing that thing. And so, maybe it serves that purpose as well, because they say, okay, we were trying to clear this valley and it was important because of this, and we made this progress, right? Those sorts of things can provide some closure and understanding. And, so yeah.
Yeah.
I
are
think there are
these
uses for this.
are these available for the general public? Like, where
Well,
can they?
when I started this process, what I had to do was write to NARA and the National Archives, and they sent me discs of files, and then I had to get them all converted from this EBIDIC file from the 1960s into modern file. It was a nightmare converting all this stuff and trying to make it usable. They have more recently made it so you can download the data sets, or most of them, in a format that's already readable. And then the problem is, then you got to know the right way to get it inputted into a GIS program. So there's some steps, but it's much less difficult now than it was. And so as I'm beginning work on part 2 of my book, this one goes to 68. I'm going to go 68 to 75. And so my plan is get more of that data and just try and see what comes out of that. Again, it's imperfect data. You got to weigh it and just see what happens. When you layer the data, you'd be amazed at what pops out that you never thought of before. Questions is like, why is that happening? The questions, the whys come out of that when you layer the data. Just by themselves, if you just have the unit deployments, like who the heck cares why a unit's in a location? But when you start layering all these sets of data, then you begin to become aware, and there's like questions that just emerge out of that. And so my plan is to work through a bunch of this data, try and create an animated series of years so you can kind of see the things moving in real time. And then based on those questions, really begin to do the research and look at the captured documents so I can really understand what the enemy's perception of this war is. As I kind of hinted, when you look at the HES data, there are a lot of accusations, and a lot of them are valid, the problems with that system. But I've gone back and looked at captured documents, and the Viet Cong had pretty much the same perception of what was going on in terms of population control. So it's at least generally correct, even though there may be individual areas where, a subsector advisor was just lazy and just checked blocks every month so he could go drinking or something.
Well, your work is amazingly important. And I'm so glad that you are pursuing this because, I think this is, going to be something that people who still struggle today that want to understand. There were people who were lost. I had cousins I lost in the Vietnam War. And, it's kind of a way to, like you say, make sense of what was actually going on, because during that time was so hush hush. And I'm so glad that you are working on, making this a clearer picture. Yay. Thank you for doing that. So.
All right.
So
Well, thank you for having me. And
oh, well, let me ask real quick. Oh, we have a question. Um, any actual number of trails that made up the Chi Minh Trail?
the Ho Chi Minh Trail.
Ho Chi Minh Trail.
I
I'm
haven't
sorry,
seen
I didn't
any
see
of
the
the
H.
GIS data related to that. Now, one thing you could look at is the bombing, right? They plotted out every bomb impact area, and so that's another whole database, the bombing campaign. And so again, you look for a template of activity. You could look at that bombing, overlay that on this, and maybe the trail would emerge out of that, right? Because obviously they're bombing where they think the enemy activity is, moving down from North Vietnam and through Laos and Cambodia. And so if you map that, things might emerge out of that. So it's a proxy, just as the Southeast Asia Friendly Forces is a proxy for allied activity. The bombing would be a proxy for that.
Good. Oh, we have a really big question. Okay, let's see. Given that GIS data has the potential to upset some of the standard narratives on the Vietnam War in South Vietnam, how receptive do you think historians will be to new interpretations?
Well, that's a problem with historians. So some people aren't, especially people who are married. As I said, we have these positional views, right? You've got, I'll break them down simplistically. There's a generalized military view of the war, and the politicians screwed it up, and that we didn't lose the war. And then you got the politicians who say no, it was the military fought the war wrong, and the military say, well, it was the press sap the will of the American people. And then academics have their own particular view. Oftentimes, they were in the anti-war movement in Vietnam, and so they spend their life justifying that position, right? These are positional histories. They aren't real histories in my mind. And so some of those people are going to be resistant, and I've faced resistance when I've talked about this. So all I can say is, as a historian, what should you do? You should look at the documents. We base our history off documents. This data is a document. You treat it like a document. You weigh it, and you lay it out there and evaluate it. And that's what I did with my book, which is, I used a lot of captured documents. I used some of this GIS data. I tried to tell a story. I started with a blank slate. I didn't pick a side. I tried to approach it with that view, and I wrote the book. And the book, even from people who are from a different side, I've generally gotten good reviews out of it. Why? Because they can't dispute. If the facts are there, the facts are there, right? Now, they can question a particular interpretation of mine. That's fine. That's what historians do. We fight with each other, and we should do that. And I should have to defend my particular analysis of those events, and I'm willing to do that. And hopefully, a good historian is willing to do that.
That's fascinating. I did not know historians fought all the time.
Oh,
but you're
go to a Vietnam War conference, and you will see some almost knuckle busting fights break out.
a big conflict, huh?
You have these different positions, and look, I respect. I mean, people, they grew up in that. That's the world they saw, and if you're not willing to get out of that and step back from your emotions, then you're going to be stuck in that. And that's one benefit, I think, of going back to this. It gives you a way to separate yourself from that. And then again, maybe the data is wrong in a certain place, and that's the story, right? Maybe that's part
Right.
of the history then, is they did a bad job, and here's what happened, and here's the proof.
There was a lot of propaganda going on during that time. There really, truly was. The
Oh, yeah.
public was not hearing anything, you know.
Well, that's what
It
the whole
was,
book is about. It's about that psychological war, propaganda war for Vietnam. So
yeah, yeah, you're right. Well, this is really encouraging that there are facts, you know, there are things we can see now that can help us to determine our own, you know, opinion of what has taken place, you know. So that's awesome. Alyssa, are there any more questions in the comments? Let's see. She may be helping somebody right now. Well, do you have any final comments or words
well,
that
it
you'd
looked
like
like
to
one
say?
just popped up on the screen there.
Oh, okay.
I can't see it now though.
Oh, I'll get it. I'll get it. Thinking more about how you are using the data for the post-TET era, do you foresee an issue since data collection at MACV probably went down as the mission drew down? Any thought on how much data you can collect with the eventual restrictions?
Um, okay, that's a good question, Kyle. And we had met at the SMH earlier this year. So yeah, absolutely. You know, you're looking at January, you know, into February of 1968. Data collection is going to be pretty spotty, and so when you're evaluating, you got to look at that. You know, but some of these things, the way the systems worked, they would still function in historical way. You might not have gotten the data in February of 1968 like you normally did, but many of those forms would be collected. They'd end up eventually at that data processing center they had in Saigon, eventually would be inputted in. So you have to be aware that there may be gaps in that 1960, you know, the early 1968 period. That once the initial threat of that had worn off, the data collection would have become more normalized, I would think. But as we begin to draw down after 1970, some of these systems are no longer collected up, right? So, you know, I gave you the ending date. Some of them are like 72 and so on, that they just stopped collecting that data. So, you know, there is that gap, and there's very little data or much less in that post 1970 period, 72 period. So that's something that has to be taken into account as I map this stuff out.
All right. Well, great. Well, this has been so informative. Thank you. And Kyle says thank you as well.
All right. Well, thank you for showing up. Appreciate it.
Yeah, well, we are thrilled. We are always interested in what you have. So next time when you've got that other book going, um, let us know, because you know, I think this is very important, especially since we have so many military in our CTC community, and you know, just in general, it's been really, really exciting. So thank you so much for this. Before we go, guys, I just want to make a couple of announcements. The explosive experience, speaking of war stuff, no, the dance event that we had scheduled for tomorrow is going to need to be postponed. So we will let you know when we're going to be offering that one. We don't have a date yet. We have next Wednesday on September 21st, we've got Fort Hood coming back again for another environmental science event. This one's on stormwater and pollution. And then on the 22nd, we have another night sky tour with CTC astronomer Warren Hart. That will be exciting. And then mark your calendars, because on Monday, September 26th. This will be in person in the library. We have City Councilman Mr. Jose Segarra, who will be coming to the library at noon on Monday, September 26th. He's going to talk about his life story, but then he's also going to talk about the importance of voting. So make sure that you make time. It's at lunch. So come on over during lunchtime to see this happen. We also had another rescheduling. Our therapeutic singing bowl demonstration has been moved from Wednesday, September 28th to November. So we just had to do a lot of schedule shifting, but we're still having them just at a different time. So you guys, thank y'all so much for keeping with us. We love our viewership. We love everyone who gets involved in all of our activities. So thank you so much, everyone. Thank you again, Dr. Roberts. It's always a pleasure. And we will see you guys next time. It's a little bit cooler, so go outside and commune with the birds and squirrels. So, all right, we'll see y'all later. And Alyssa, if you will take us out. Bye, guys.